Now let us move on to the scope and limitations of the study. So your scope and limitation determines the coverage of the study and all the things that it will not cover in order for you to be specific. So basically, in scope of limitations, you mentioned there all the boundaries, all the limitations and the weaknesses of your research paper. So in here, you identify the limitations of your variables, the limitations of your sampling method that you have actually used, the limitations of your statistical tests, and all of those things. Now, I would like to differentiate scope and limitations. So scope, because it may sound that these two things are the same, but they actually have different bearings. So we have scope. Scope actually means or refers to the coverage or focus of your study. So again, scope refers to the coverage or focus of your study, whereas limitations, on the other hand, refers to the inherent weakness of your study. Okay, so example would be your sampling method. If you have used a purposive sampling, that is an inherent weakness in your study, so you need to acknowledge that. You need to state it here in the scope of scope and limitations of the study. So again, the scope is the coverage or focus of your study, which means what your study would cover or what it would include, whereas limitations, on the other hand, are the inherent weaknesses of your study. Okay, next is the definition of terms. So the definition of terms defines technical terms and how they are used on the study. So this is technical on how they are used in the study. So it provides the readers or future researchers with the basic terminologies that are important to understand the paper. Now, there are actually two types of, or you need to provide two definitions for each of the term or variable that you will be using. You need to provide for the conceptual definition and you also need to provide for the operational definition. Okay, so conceptual definition is actually defining terms using related concept or how the word is actually defined when you use a dictionary or when you use Google or you basically search for its definition. That is the conceptual definition. When you say operational definition, this is how the variable or the term is being used in your study. Now, an example of the differentiation of the two would be, example is knowledge. So knowledge, when you define it using a dictionary for its conceptual definition, it actually means the facts or information that you have regarding a certain phenomenon or like that is a conceptual definition of knowledge. Now, in operational definition, you can define knowledge based on how it is used or assessed in your study. Example, the level of knowledge of your respondent is assessed through a multiple choice questionnaire or through a quiz. And then eventually these scores are categorized. You could categorize them into poor knowledge, fair knowledge, or good knowledge. So the categorization, the scoring, and the actual use of a quiz is basically the operational definition of knowledge. It again states how the variable is being tested or how it is being assessed in your research study. So definition of terms, it defines technical terms on how they're used used in the study. It also provides the readers or future researchers with the basic terminologies that are important to understand the paper. Then we have the conceptual definition and then the operational definition. Okay, moving on to chapter 2. So we already completed chapter 1. We have discussed about the background of the study, basically an introduction as to what the problem is all about and what a little bit of the context of the previous researches that have led you to conduct your own research study about that certain phenomenon. And then we have the statement of the problem, which presents the main problem, and then eventually to the specific questions that you wish to answer in your research study. And then the significance of the study, which basically talks about why you conducted the study, like why is it important in the society, the community, or in the example for us medical technologists, our research is more focused on what it could do to the health or to health systems or to improvement of health of an individual. And then we have the two types of significance of the study, the theoretical significance as well as the practical significance. Then we have already talked about the assumptions of the study. I also forgot to mention that other studies use the hypothesis instead of the assumptions, while other studies also use assumptions instead of the hypothesis. It actually depends on the institution that orders you to do the research. And then we also talked about the scope and limitations of the study. Again, the scope is the coverage or focus of your study. The limitations are the inherent weaknesses of your study. Then the definition of terms, we have the conceptual definition, like how it is defined in dictionaries or when you search it on search engines. And then operational definition, the definition of the variable as it is being used in your research study. Now moving on to the review of related literature, this is where you will use your note cards. And will serve as the foundation of your research. So in the review of related literature, we basically present a gist of each of the studies that have already been conducted about the phenomena or your subject matter of interest. So by presenting those previous studies, you're actually also presenting the gaps, the limitations of those studies, which would eventually lead you which would eventually explain as to why you needed to conduct the research study. So basically, a good review of related literature would actually help you to form your studies. You would also be able to have an idea of the past methodologies that have been utilized by those previous researches, which would also help you in forming your own methodologies in your research. It is important that when you do review of related literature, you must not directly lift words from other sources because again, you would be held accountable for plagiarism. Okay, so for the steps of the review of related literature, first is to organize your note cards on how you would want them to appear in the chapter. So your note cards are basically, I haven't actually used note cards or what it implies here during research. I just searched, in our case, I just searched for related studies, made a summary out of them, and then organized them in such a way that they are cohesive in chapter 2. And then begin writing the chapter while including the surnames of the authors who provided sources of your study and publication date of their work in parentheses. So example, Dalisay 2020. And then you edit and then you rewrite. Next is chapter 3. Moving on to the method of research. The kind of research used by your study, may it be qualitative or quantitative, may it be a correlational or a causal relationship, which is often experimental. Was it a descriptive study? It is in here that you describe what type of research did you use in your study. So it also answers why the method used is appropriate for the study. So for example, if you wish to determine the relationship variables, then the appropriate research study that you would use would be correlational. So in here, you would explain why is that the case. And then subjects of the study, it describes your respondents. It describes your respondents, who they are, what their profile is, or what they are from. So often in the subjects of the study, you just describe the social demographic characteristics of your respondents. Well, that actually depends as to what characteristics of the population are you assessing in your study. But often that is the case. You describe their age, their sex at birth, and all those information. Okay, next is description of your research instrument, which basically describes your instrument. If you used a multiple choice questionnaire, if you used a checklist, or any of those research instrument, you provide it here as to how did you formulate it, did you devise it basing it upon a previous questionnaire, or yeah. Next is data gathering procedure. So this narrates the process undergone by the study that eventually leads to findings. Here in the data gathering procedure, you narrate the process step by step, starting off even from the sampling method that you use, the actual sampling procedure, and then the data collection, then the data entry, the data processing, eventually to the data analysis and interpretation. You need to provide a detailed narration of this information in order, because this is actually examined by an ethics committee, or for example, a researcher wants to conduct a similar study as you did. So this data gathering procedure part would actually be guide for them when they do a similar study as yours. Next is statistical treatment applied. The statistical treatment that you will use, which includes your sampling method and formulas to come up. So either you use Pearson correlations, Spearman correlation, ANOVA, etc. Anyways, these statistical tests would actually be discussed along the way. Okay, chapter 4, we're already done with chapter 3. We have discussed about the parts, the methods of the research, the subjects of the study, the description of research instrument, as well as the data gathering procedure and the statistical treatment applied. Next is the results of the study. The results of the study presents all the data gathered by tabulating all the gathered information. It is also an interpretation rather of each presented data should follow. And serves as the basis of the summary of findings. Okay, so in the results of the study, you already have your processed data, the summarized data, which is already placed in a table, which will give us, which would allow for easier understanding or comprehension of how you process the data that you have collected. And you must remember that for every table that you have, or for every graph that you have, there must be a corresponding interpretation of what that table contains. Okay, because again, your results of the study would actually serve as the basis for your summary of findings. Okay, now moving on to the summary of findings. It summarizes the interpretation of data given in chapter 4. This should directly answer the statement problem. So for example, if your statement of the problem was you have recognized that there is a need for improvement of a certain blood pressure medication, so you develop medication X, for example. So So the summary of findings, if you found out that there is a significant difference in the result of the blood pressure of those who have taken those medication, then summary of findings will basically describe or elaborate the findings that there is a significant difference on the blood pressure level after receiving medication X. So that is the summary of findings, just a concise paragraph or few paragraphs about your chapter 4, which is the results and discussions. Okay, next is conclusion, which is this one is based on the findings your conclusions are drawn from. It provides the answer for every statement of the problem. Diba, in the statement of the problem part in chapter 1, you have seen there a series of questions that you are seeking to answer by the end of conducting your research paper. So it is seen here in the conclusion that you will directly answer those questions. So, and this is where you will prove your hypothesis and your assumptions. Again, the conclusion, this is out of the findings, your conclusions are based or your conclusions are drawn. It provides the answer for every statement of the problem. It is also in the conclusion part where you will prove your hypothesis as well as your assumptions. Now moving on to the recommendations. By the way, this is already chapter 5, starting from the summary of findings. This is chapter 5, and then we have the conclusion and now the recommendations. So your recommendations should be directly based on the significance of the study. So it includes the recommended actions that should be done after the conduct of the study. So as mentioned earlier in the significance, you actually state in there what are the probable practical uses or potential of your research study and what it could do or help in the community or to a certain group of people. So example, in your study you have found out that there is low awareness on hypertension in a certain community. So in your recommendations, you can actually recommend for the local government unit of that particular community or group of people to form programs that would educate these people about hypertension, what are its probable risk factors. So that is an example of a recommendation. Next is list of tables and figures, which contains the accurate paging of tables and figures used in the study. Actually, I believe it depends on which institution you are from, because from where I graduated, we actually place the list of tables and figures after table of contents. So we have the title, the abstract, the acknowledgement, and then the table of contents, and then follows the list of tables and figures. Next are the references or bibliography. So this contains a list and an alphabetical list of all the resources or references that you have used in your study. So where you will use your source cards presents the source using either APA or MLA format depending on the instructions maybe of your research advisor or something. So APA actually means American Psychological Association, whereas MLA means Modern Language Association. So APA format, this is often used in social sciences, education, or other related fields. It also focuses on concise, objective writing, and emphasizes empirical evidence. Okay, between APA and MLA format, they also differ in terms of how the references are written both in the in-text citations as well as in the reference list. So focuses on social sciences and education, and also concise, objective writing, and empirical evidence. So the order of the elements being written in the reference list following the APA format is as follows. We first have the author's last name, then the first initial of the author, and then the year enclosed in parentheses, followed by a period, also here, another period here, the book title, and then the subtitle, the edition, if there is multiple editions of that reference material, and then the publisher. And in text citation, the parenthetical, we have here the author or the year, and then in the narrative, where you mention the author's name, just mention his name and what he or she says about your topic, and then the year is enclosed in parentheses. Okay, so this is the APA format. On the other hand, the MLA format or the Modern Language Association, it is actually used in humanities, like languages, literature, and media studies. Okay, I'll just add it here, which is another description for MLA format. Focuses on analyzing and interpreting texts, this is G, and ideas. Okay, so MLA format, these are used in humanities studies like languages, literature, and media studies, and it also focuses on analyzing and interpreting texts and ideas. So in the reference list, this is how the elements of the reference that you have used are arranged in MLA format. You start with the author's last name and then you spell out the first name. Basically, very different from the APA format where you only make use of the author's first initial. And then the source title is actually placed in parentheses, container title, other contributors, versions, numbers, publisher, publication date, and location. So the elements are also separated by comma, except for these that are separated by period. So the source title is actually the title of the excerpt or of the literature that you have cited in your study. The container title is more like the book. If it is part of a book, like example, if it is a poem and the book is a collection of all the poems, then the container title is the title of the entire book that contains all of those poems. And then other contributors, versions, and numbers if it's part of the series, publisher, publication date, and location. So for the in-text citation, following MLA format, you have here the parenthetical placed inside the parentheses using the author's last name, and instead of using year such as in APA format, you actually use the page number. And if in narrative wherein you mention the author's name, you actually cite the author's name, what you will place inside the parentheses would only be then the page number. Okay? So that is MLA format, and then this one is APA format. Then last part of the structure of a research paper, we have here the appendices. Appendices include the tool and relevant supplementary documents that you have used in your studies, such as attachment, survey questionnaire, interview questions, etc. So the number of appendices you have in your research study depends on the number of documents that you used. So in here, this was actually the first page or the appendix A of our studies, which contains the approval form from our ethics committee, and then you have the research questionnaires, the permissions for each of the institutions that you